Health, Psychology and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Friends, this is a very big day. Very warm welcome to the first episode of Health, Psychology and Human Nature with me, André Sturesson. This podcast is about, you guessed it, health, psychology and human nature. And this is the start of our long journey together. And I'm really happy to have you with me. We will get into health, things like exercise, aging, sleep, diet, fasting, omega-3, vitamin D, and a lot more. We'll also get into psychology, so things like personality, cognitive behavioral therapy, meditation, mindsets, intelligence, and tons more. And we'll also explore human nature. We will try to understand ourselves better. And this is a science-focused podcast, so today's guests and the vast majority are researchers, and that is because they know their subject really well. This podcast also exists on Instagram and Facebook with the same name as the podcast, Health, Psychology and Human Nature. Follow me there for the latest episodes, inspiration and more. So, the first episode. Can we change how we feel by moving? Today, me and Mats Hallgren discussed the very interesting effect from exercise on mental health. Exercise is as effective as both antidepressants and cognitive behavioral therapy for mild to moderate depression. It can really affect how we feel. We'll also talk about physical inactivity, the effects of exercise on the brain and cognition, and a lot more. Mats Hallgren, he's an assistant professor at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and he studies the link between exercise and mental health. So, my friend, this is the start of our journey together. Without further ado, here's the first episode. Seems to be working.
Excellent.
Mats, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
So glad to have you. You were my last podcast, Stressskolan for Stress Management, Swedish podcast.
I remember it well.
Yeah, so nice to have you back.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah, it's kind of, I saw on your Karolinska Institute page that you had a sentence saying, I'm an Australian with a very Swedish name.
That's right. Yeah, I think people are very confused by my name because I speak some Swedish, as you know, but always with a very strong accent.
Yeah.
But my name is very Swedish, Mats-Åke Hallgren.
Yeah.
From Melbourne. It's a good starting point for conversation.
It is, right?
Yeah.
But you must get that a lot, because I was also talking to a friend and I was talking about I'm going to have a conversation with you, and then I was like, yeah, but then he's Swedish, right? No, he's Australian.
That's right.
What? And then we had to talk about it like a minute before. He's like, no, he's Australian, but then he moved to Sweden.
It's funny because in Australia, people really have trouble with the name Mats.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I'm normally called Matthew or Max.
Yeah.
But then in the late 80s, there was a famous Swedish tennis player, Mats Wilander, who came on the scene. He was the number one in the world for a short time.
Yeah.
And suddenly everyone knew my name.
Right.
So I actually wrote him a letter and said, thank you for becoming thank you for becoming the best in the world, because this has changed my life. I don't have to introduce myself 5 times now.
Finally.
Yeah.
Finally, Mats has become a lot more international.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Cool.
So...
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. You're researching some really, really fascinating stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, my research is focused on physical activity, exercise. Exercise is what we call a subset of physical activity that's structured and purposeful, and the links with mental health. So not just depression and anxiety, that's one of the most common mental disorders, but also I was involved in a study in psychosis and more recently on substance use.
Right.
So it's a It's an interesting topic, and it's been expanding a lot in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years.
What is it that you find most interesting with physical exercise?
Yeah. Well, my interest in it started just with personal experience. I've just always loved exercise, and I've understood simply from my own experience that it's a great way to feel relaxed, less anxious. You know, before I came in today, for example, I did 25 minutes of yoga and stretching, and just felt a bit better, a bit more relaxed. So for me, everything really just started from that point. And then I studied psychology, and to sort of somehow join those two was a natural progression. And it's also about the connection between the mind and the body,
right?
Which I think is, central to
it's so central,
being human.
Yeah.
Without sounding too cliched, but I mean it is, and it involves biology and understanding how we evolved. I mean, as we've discussed previously, we've evolved to move, and I think we're moving less. Society's structured in a way now that makes it much, much easier to be sedentary. So we're sort of fighting against that in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've also became interested, I think, in exercise and its effect on mental health, similarly like you did. I also recognized when I was doing a lot of exercise. I went to the gym when I was when I was younger, and I could really feel the effect. It was so obvious. Like went to the gym afterwards, felt a bit euphoric almost. Like I usually exercise 10 minutes each morning. I get up, go to the bathroom, and then I'll do like 10-minute jog, or I do some push-ups or whatever. And it's so obvious, like how I feel before and after just a 10-minute exercise.
And that's the good message, is that I think you don't necessarily need to do an hour.
Right.
Even short amounts, 10 to 15 minutes can change the blood flow, especially to the brain, and can make people feel a little bit more clear and crisp in the morning.
Yeah.
If that's your goal. And it's great. But the interesting thing is that although most people, when you talk to them about this, they say, "Oh yeah, I know this."
Yeah.
People say, "Well, that's obvious," and it is obvious.
Yeah.
And I think Hippocrates, a long way back, once said, "If you're in a bad mood, take a walk. If you're still in a bad mood, take another walk." Right. So the message isn't new, but what's interesting is that message still is a little bit slow to feed into guidelines, official recommendations for the treatment of mental illness.
Yeah.
Not just in Sweden, but in Australia, the US. Canada has been leading the way a little bit in that regard. But we've been working on that a lot to try to raise the status of physical movement as a potential treatment on its own, or as an adjunct to taking medicine and talking therapy. I don't think it's always a complete replacement for medicine. Sometimes that's needed, but I think it's almost always a good complement.
But that's the research has really taken off, right? If you compare it to 20 years ago.
It has, yeah, very much so. What's happened is that there's been a lot more studies on what happens when people perform a single bout of exercise.
Yep.
So they're called acute exercise studies. So measuring changes in people's mood before and after a 30-minute run or bike ride and so on. And that's important because when you think of it, exercise is comprised of lots of single sessions of exercise, right? But then there's been more and more of these big trials. We call them randomized control trials, where you assign people randomly to different groups to receive either exercise or some other treatment, or perhaps a control intervention, a wait list, and then compare the results before and after. And we've been able to, as those have increased in number, we've been able to pull the results of those studies into what we call meta-analysis. And that gives us a guide as to the relative strength of the effects of exercise on different mental health outcomes. So these summaries of the evidence have been increasing and have been very important.
What do they say about depression?
They basically tell us that exercise has effects on depression mild to moderately severe depression that are equivalent to medication or equivalent to counseling type therapies, and better than getting nothing, right? So I think that's an enormous finding in itself.
Yeah, for sure.
That exercise can be just as good for you as talking therapy. And one of the reasons that's interesting also is because in the training of psychologists and psychiatrists who do a lot of the talking therapy, they don't get much, if any, training in the effects of exercise on mental health.
Right.
So that's another gap that we're working towards filling. I think that's...
Yeah, I remember when we had our last conversation, you talked about this study that was about how often, I think it was doctors or something like that, how often they recommend physical exercise or something like that, right?
There's several studies. Oh, yes, I know the one you mean. That was a Swedish study. Yeah, exactly. And it was measuring the number of times that in general practice that exercise was prescribed for any health problem. And out of I think it was 1 in 1,000 occasions that someone went to the GP clinic.
Yeah.
So out of 1,000 people turning up to the GP clinic, there was only one occasion per 1,000 when exercise was prescribed for any health problem.
Right.
So not just for mental health, but for anything.
Okay, yeah.
So, and this has been a very big focus of attention. Why is it that that doctors are not prescribing exercise more often? And it's because they're very busy. They don't see it as their core business. They don't necessarily have the expertise or training in exercise prescription. So we've been working hard to try to facilitate that in some way. For example, getting physiotherapists or physical therapists actually connected with mental health clinics or with GP clinics so that they can be referred to them in-house, so to speak, and someone can get onto that exercise routine quicker. But these things take a lot of time, you know. I mean, medical doctors have a particular way of working that they're familiar with, and so we have to work around that and within that system.
Yeah. So, but you say that how big are the effects for somebody who let's say somebody who's depressed and would like to start? Like, what does the meta-analysis say about, like, how big is the effect for them?
So the meta-analysis show it depends which meta-analysis we look at, because several have been done. But I think overall it's in the moderate range, moderate, what we call effect sizes. But to people listening, that they may not know exactly what that means. So if I give an example with a study that we recently did, it was called Regassa in Sweden. So this was the largest trial of exercise for depression. We had 900.
You only do big trials.
We only do big trials here, at the Karolinska Institute. 945 adults. Yeah. And what we saw was that after 12 weeks of treatment, so we were comparing 12 weeks of exercise with 12 weeks of usual care, which meant that the person with depression went to see their house doctor or GP, and internet-based therapy, which is becoming more popular. So what we found basically was that the people in the exercise group did much better after the 12 weeks compared to the ones who saw their GP. Yeah. And they went from, they didn't, most of them didn't completely reach the level of remission. They still had some symptoms, but they went from moderately severe depression to a mild level of depression or remission at 12 weeks. So they're terms that I think people can probably understand a little better than small, medium, and large effect sizes.
So it went from quite depressed to not so depressed or no depression at all.
Yeah, the point is there was a clinically meaningful change in their level of depression before and after the intervention. Yeah. So it wasn't just a statistically significant difference. Sometimes trials report a significant change in depression severity or anxiety or whatever you're measuring, but that may not necessarily translate into what we think is a clinically meaningful change, something that the person feels has and is affecting their life. So that's the feedback. That's what we saw in that trial, which was the largest one to date. And we got feedback from participants in the trial saying that mostly, yes, this really had impacted my life in a positive way. So that was a really impressive finding for us. Yeah,
I think it's so interesting also with like for depression, for example, that you really see an effect. So it's 12 weeks, so it's in long term. So it's both in the long term that you can measure and really find differences. But you also often, like as you and I discussed previously, you also have this acute effect. Like, I don't feel as good today. I go off for a fast walk, I come back, and I feel better. So it's really you really do have both these, both long-term and short-term effects.
Exactly. Yeah. So the studies have been divided into two types, as I mentioned. These acute studies and the long-term studies. But we shouldn't only focus on the long-term studies. I think they're very relevant clinically, but the acute studies give the message that even single bouts of exercise can make people feel good.
Yeah.
So, if you're someone who, for example, tends to feel highly anxious in general, or if you're anxious because you have a stressful event coming up, presentation or something like that, you can use exercise to help you in a short-term way.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do this intuitively.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but still, it is interesting. Even though most people understand that exercise is so good for us, we're still a highly inactive society in general. I think depending on the country we look at, the percentage of people who don't meet the minimum physical activity requirements is somewhere around 70% of the population.
And what are the requirements then?
Sure. So it's 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, or 75 minutes of vigorous or a equivalent combination. So it's like 30 minutes a day, roughly.
So 70% of the population. Is that in Sweden or internationally?
I'm making a generalization, so it does depend on where you make the survey. So, but approximately 70%, I think, is a good ballpark, an accurate ballpark figure. A lot of the surveys show that it's more like 40 or 50% who are inactive. Okay. But in reality, we know that it's much higher than that, because that's based on self-report. So people always say they do more exercise than they actually do.
That's the problem with those kind of studies, right? Self-report studies.
It is. That's right. If you give people what we call an accelerometer to measure the steps and the movements, you see that they grossly overestimate how much they move and underestimate how much they sit. One thing that's interesting about this, though, is that we know that health behaviors tend to cluster. So often if you can change one, like physical activity, you change another, like diet, as you were talking about, or smoking. People normally find that they're incongruent. So in their mind and also in their body, they feel that smoking, for example, is inconsistent with going out and having an effective run or an effective training session. And it's the same with perhaps with drinking. Although that's slightly different. Sometimes people who are very active also drink a lot. So that's a bit paradoxical. But in general, health behaviors tend to cluster. Yeah.
But you said that like 70% didn't meet the requirements. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, good question. You
if I got the answer to that, then
you always ask the tough questions. So I think there's various explanations. If we think about how society has changed in a relatively short time, I mean, we evolved to move. We were born to move. It's natural. But society is set up more and more so that it's easier to be sedentary and sit still. A lot of people work in offices. What do we do in offices? We sit still. Slowly, that's starting to change. There's a recognition that sitting for too long during the day is not good for us, so we have these stand-up desks and so on. Slowly, that's changing. In terms of transport, how do most people get to work? Buses and trains. Sweden and Stockholm is not the best example because people are really good here at being active. So this morning when I was riding to work, there were tons of people on bikes, tons of people walking, but that's not the case everywhere in all high-income countries. So globally, there is definitely a problem with inactivity, especially in high-income countries. So I think it's partly structural. It's got to do with the way that society is set up and operates. It's also, I think, motivation and discipline. It's not easy to get people into a structured routine of physical activity. I think people need to make connections that they personally understand or relate to between being inactive and bad health outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's not always clear to people. They tend to underestimate some of the risks to them personally of being inactive.
But isn't it also that you don't really feel the health consequences straight away?
Yes.
If you're inactive or if you're a smoker or whatever, you don't really. It's not like now I get the really bad health outcome straight away. It's something that really develops over time and something that perhaps affects your mood, but it's not like it's not something that happens straight away. Yeah.
Good point. Yeah, I agree completely. That's another important point. The health benefits may not be in terms of, for example, reduced cardiovascular disease or your reduced risk of diabetes. Yeah. It might be something that evolves over 10, 20 years, that protection. So you're absolutely right. That's not something you would immediately see.
And those kinds of things, I think, almost would even be harder.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you can't see that inflammatory markers are going down systemically in your body, for instance, even though that's what happens chronically with regular exercise. Yeah. And that's related to better somatic and psychiatric health. So
but then, of course, as we said before, everything is. It's so interconnected. The body and the mind it really affects each other. So
very much. But of course, I think my focus as a researcher is always on physical activity and mental health. I'm a little bit obsessed with it, but it's important to remember that there are other factors that are linked to mental health. Of course, I think. And this brings up this idea of well-being in general. What makes people feel well?
Right. Yeah.
And to me, it's very much, personally, to me, it's very much a physical thing. If I'm not feeling physically well and fit, I don't feel well. But we also know, of course, that social connection is very important to people's wellness, and that's an area of research on itself. Feeling that you've got people that you can rely on, that you're close to. And feeling that you live also in a society where you can communicate with people, that you're connected in some sense, is linked to wellness and mental well-being. It's interesting. I was thinking over the weekend about mental health and well-being and what it means. And as I say, to me, it's something that's very physical and psychiatric because of my background and training. But I was thinking about Aboriginal Australians, for instance. What does well-being mean to them? And I think, it's less about going for a jog and feeling good in their head, and it's more about spirituality, feeling connected to the land that they live in, feeling connected to the people that are part of that land, its history, and so on. And then, of course, there's the economic side that people need to feel good. Most people need a minimum level of economic security to feel well. So I'm sort of broadening our discussion here a bit, but
for sure.
I think it's always important to remember that while physical activity is really important, there's other aspects to
for sure.
mental health and well-being, of course.
Yeah. But I really think that, or from my experience or from what I've learned, is that physical activity really is one of the cornerstones. I mean, I think there's a few ones, like there's sleep. If you don't sleep, you won't, I mean, nothing will work, not biologically or psychologically. And then we got diet, and then we got, as you said, relationships. Stress is probably one of the big ones. But then physical exercise is really one of the big ones as well. I mean, the effects they're so obvious, and also like in the literature as well, you can really see the big effects.
You're right. And I think all of those things, sleep, exercise, diet, it's all interconnected. One feeds off the other. I was reflecting as well on this idea of wellness, and there's a psychologist, an American psychologist named Maslow. Have you heard of his hierarchy of needs?
Hierarchy of needs.
And at the bottom of this hierarchy, he talks about food and shelter. So, and I was thinking about this in the hierarchy. So physical activity is probably somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, and at the top you would have
self-actualization and
work-related things, achievements in that domain. But I think we can't sort of also forget entirely about the economic status that people need in order to be able to have opportunities to exercise and so on. So that's a sort of starting point for everything. But you're right. It's sleep, physical activity, diet. It's all part of. I know that when I get those things right, I feel much better. Yeah.
But again, it's also like this really the mind-body connection. Like if we take care of the physical, because those things, of course, they affect the mental. But I see diet, for example, is very physical. I mean, it's you eat stuff, stuff becomes a part of you, and that affects your subjectivity. So that affects your experience. So I feel better. I eat good stuff, which makes my body healthier, and that results in me also having I feel better and everything. So it's so obvious also that I think they're so interconnected.
Yes, I'm not an expert on diet and nutrition, but just have a personal interest in it. But I know there's a lot of research that's come out recently on the gut and connections between the gut and the brain. And that does interest me a lot. And I think there are studies showing that when you have a better diet, a more nutrient diet, that's anti-inflammatory, among other things. That can be linked to better overall health and psychiatric health. Which is fascinating.
I think inflammation is everywhere now.
It's a big topic.
And also, I mean, it affects everything kind of. Also,
and exercise can acutely raise inflammation, but when it's done chronically, it tends to lower it. So your systemic level tends to be lower if you're a regular exerciser.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, and those changes in inflammatory markers have been linked to changes in indicators of mental health.
Oh, that's interesting.
Including depression.
Oh, really? So that's one of the things that's probably contributing to the effects of mental health.
I think it's one of the underlying mechanisms. So no doubt there's many. We have the monoamine system, so serotonin and dopamine. There are these chemicals, neurochemicals in the brain are also affected by exercise. And they're also targeted by medications for people that have depression. So I think potentially exercise could be in some people, under the right circumstances, could be a substitute for taking medicine. I say that very, very cautiously because there is without doubt a role for medicine in people who are severely depressed. So we should never forget that. But I think given that the underlying mechanisms in terms of how these medicines work overlaps with the way exercise has an effect on mental health, there's potentially an opportunity to replace some medication use with exercise if we see that it's effective in people. And not everyone responds to exercise for depression, and we don't quite know why.
No.
If this is an underlying genetic issue or if it's more psychosocial. But there are studies going on which are trying to identify the genome profile that's linked to exercise having an effect on somatic and mental health. So we'll see what that shows in the future. But the vast majority of people respond well to exercise.
Yeah, that's kind of a cool thing as well. It's one of those things that seems to affect the general population.
Yes.
But that's also very interesting, I think, because in these big studies that you've done, and also when you and your colleagues are doing these kind of studies, can you say something about like who responds well and who doesn't respond well? Is there anything that you think contributes to some people, even though they do the same kind of physical activity or exercise? Is there anything that you believe, like from your research that you've seen?
Yes, there are some factors that stand out. What we haven't been able to do is to identify a biological profile of who responds best and who doesn't.
Right.
So that's for the future.
Yeah.
So it would be, ideally, we'd like to sort of develop a list of factors that include a genetic profile of the people who are most likely to respond.
Yeah.
So that then we could potentially, I mean, this is in the future, look at a person's profile, which includes a biological profile, a psychosocial profile, and then try to determine how likely they are to respond to exercise as a treatment for depression, anxiety, etc. We're not quite at that stage yet, but I think that's where the research is heading. But we know, for example, this is relatively basic stuff, but supervision is very important. Adherence is very important. You know, people tend to drop out from exercise interventions. So it is a challenge to get people to, starting is one thing, but then continuing is another.
Yeah.
And this isn't unique to people that have mental health problems. I mean, in the general population, we have similar difficulties. Adherence is an issue there, but it's exacerbated in people that have mental health problems, and perhaps more so in people that have serious mental health problems, because they struggle a bit more with organisation and cognition.
Yeah.
So that's one issue. Also, in terms of support, I'm not just talking about support from a personal trainer, but social support.
Yeah.
So when people tell family and friends that they have a goal, what that is, and get support in achieving that goal, that tends to lead to more adherence and better outcomes. The people that do the worst are the ones that don't follow the regime that we recommend and drop out of a study, not surprisingly. So a supervision, support, adherence, that's what makes the difference in these trials, that people actually do what we ask them to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is challenging, but more and more we're understanding what factors can help with that.
Yeah. Are you working, when you're doing these kind of studies, are you working anything with like motivation? Because I think you mentioned before that you have to have something that is relevant for yourself. Is that something you work with as well in these studies, or are you mostly just saying that this is what you're supposed to do? And
personally, I haven't included a motivational component in these studies. But there are studies out there that have done that. They've complemented the exercise prescription with a type of behavioral intervention to try to get people to do it.
Yeah.
And that's recommended more and more. The trick though is, you know, the more of that you do, you're starting to combine different interventions in one.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So then the question becomes, well, what's actually causing the effect?
Yeah. True.
But, you know, at the end of the day, I don't think that necessarily matters, because what matters is that you encourage people to exercise regularly. And by using behavioral therapy techniques, to get people to make links between exercising and benefits from that, or reducing risks, getting them to understand how they need to change their lifestyle in a practical way so that exercise becomes easier. I think all of that's important. It's a bit difficult to necessarily do all of that in a trial because it takes extra resources. And I think also sometimes it's interesting just to see the effect of what happens when you give people some support, but not too much, a level of support that you could replicate in, for example, a GP clinic. So that's what we're doing at the moment in a trial that I'm involved in of exercise for alcohol use disorder.
Yeah.
So it's over 12 weeks, and we give people 3 PT sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So not every week, but 3 times over 3 months. And then we see them in the middle of the trial as well. So they have some regular contact, but it's not over-the-top support that's unrealistic, that couldn't be replicated. So I think if you're interested in establishing what we call efficacy, so can something work, it's good to include all of these techniques in a trial perhaps. But if you want to establish effectiveness, so can this work in a less supported environment, taking away some of these additional supports and efforts, I think that answers a slightly different question. And that's been more my focus. What's the real world implication, or how will this work outside of the study?
How could we get this to actually work on people?
Correct.
Like, how could it really have an effect?
Yes.
Kind of. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, exactly.
But this new study that you're doing, could you tell us just very like a summarize of the study that you're doing now?
So I've been involved in trials of exercise for depression and anxiety and for psychosis, but there's in terms of mental health, there's a third area that's very important. That's substance abuse. So that includes illicit drugs, but also legal drugs like alcohol. And alcohol is responsible for a very large portion of the global burden of disease and disability.
Yeah.
And we know that a lot of people, don't seek treatment. And so we decided to set up a trial to make treatment a bit more attractive by focusing on lifestyle, including physical activity. And this is something that it resonates with people. A lot of people feel that there's a stigma and there's a shame with turning up to an alcohol clinic and being labelled alcoholic.
Yeah.
And I understand that.
Yeah.
However, if we put the emphasis on lifestyle, and people can relate to that. So that's what the trial is about. We actually focus less on their drinking per se, and just focus more on changing their activity levels and their overall lifestyle, focusing mainly on physical activity, and then see what happens.
Okay, so you're not focusing on stop drinking. You're focusing on adding exercise to their lives.
Yes, we don't advise them in any way to change their drinking.
Right.
We just give them advice about exercise, and we do tell them that there is evidence to show that exercising regularly can help with alcohol consumption. So we imply, we make a thread there for them, and we imply that it could help with their drinking, but don't directly instruct them to change their drinking. We just want to advise them to exercise, how often, what type of exercise to do, and then we observe what happens before and after. So that study's ongoing. We've got 140 participants, and we're aiming for 210. So it'll be the largest trial of exercise for alcohol use disorder that's been done.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, thanks.
But you've been doing this study now for how long has it been running?
2 years.
2 years now.
Yeah, yeah. These trials take time.
Yeah,
they really do. They take time and a great deal of effort. But what's interesting is the recruitment. So when we recruit people into this study, we've just placed a single advertisement in a local newspaper, Midday, it's called in Stockholm. So it goes out to all households in Stockholm County.
Yeah.
And from that single ad for 1 day only, we receive 200 plus emails and phone calls.
Wow.
So there's lots
There's
of
a big interest.
It's a lot of interest, yeah. So it seems that we're tapping into a group of people who otherwise wouldn't seek treatment or receive it.
Yeah.
And in fact, we know from research that about 80% of people that have an alcohol use disorder never receive treatment. For the reasons I mentioned before, stigma, they're not satisfied necessarily with the types of treatments that are available. They don't want medicine necessarily.
What does the data say about how effective it is when it comes to
good question. Yeah, so we did the first meta-analysis of this. We found 21 studies that were published between the early 70s and up until 2016, if I remember. But most of those studies were very poorly conducted and had few participants.
Yeah.
However, there are 3 studies that have been more methodologically sound with larger numbers of participants. And 2 of those studies found positive effects on drinking. But, it's really an early stage for this area of research. There's not a lot of research on exercise and substance misuse in general. So we're trying to some extent, break new ground and do a big study and a well-conducted trial and overcome some of the methodological problems in previous studies. And the main thing we want to do is to get people to exercise regularly.
Yeah.
So hopefully you can come back in a year and we'll do the interview again and I'll tell you what we found.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to take a break? All right. We just had a short break. Now we're on it again.
We've replenished we've hydrated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit about physical inactivity when we were having a short break, because that is something that I don't know a lot about, and it's also something that is becoming quite hot. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
So it's called sedentary behavior.
Yeah.
In essence, too much sitting. And so over the past, 15 to 20 years, there's been a research emerging showing links between spending too much time sitting still and different health outcomes, especially cardiovascular disease, diabetes. There's been a strong focus on that. But in the last, I'd say, roughly 5 to 7 years, the research has turned to links with mental health. So the early research was showing that when people sit still for a long time, it has detrimental or bad links to different high prevalence health outcomes like heart disease. You're more likely to have heart disease if you spend a lot of time during the day sitting still, for example, 8 to 10 hours a day.
This doesn't matter, right? So if you're let's say if you're sitting still 8 to 10 hours, and then after you're done with your workday, you go to the gym.
This is the big question, André.
Oh, we don't know that yet.
Well, we're starting to get some insights into this. So can you compensate by engaging in structured exercise? Because so many of us are working in offices where we are not necessarily forced, but it's much easier. It's very easy to sit still during the day.
Yeah.
I mean, I do that. I try to break it up by standing up, but for most of us here, we sit still for a long time during the day because we work with computers. So the question is, can you offset or attenuate some of those effects with structured exercise? And it seems that you can, but it only at very high levels of structured exercise. So, for example, a study came out recently which showed that if you engage in about an hour of moderate to vigorous exercise every day, this largely offsets or attenuates the bad effects of sitting still for 7, 8, 9 hours a day.
Okay.
The outcome they had there was increased risk of death. So what we're now trying to do is see if similar links exist with mental health. And there are some studies that have examined this that show that, like with physical health, it's bad for your mental health to sit still for too long. And those effects, importantly, are largely independent of structured exercise. So most people don't exercise for a solid hour a day. I'd say that's about 1% of the population, if that. So I think we can generalize and say that sitting still for 7, 8, 10 hours a day, and many people do sit still for that long, that's bad for our health.
Okay, so what you believe is that if you're sitting still and let's say you're not doing, let's say you're taking a half an hour walk, that would probably wouldn't be enough.
No, it wouldn't. Any breaks in sitting still or any exercise that you do in addition to sitting still during the day is only a good thing. But where the evidence is at the moment, it suggests that having a half-hour walk during the day would not offset the independent detrimental effect that sitting still has on...
Not even if it's during the day. So let's say if you're working 4 hours, you'll go for half an hour walk on your lunch.
Yes.
And you eat for a fast lunch, 15 minutes. Then you still get the bad effects for sitting still. Probably.
Correct.
Oh, really?
Yes, which is surprising, I know. And I should emphasize that having the half-hour walk would be better than not having it. You would still see some reduced risk with the half-hour walk each day, but it doesn't entirely offset the independent risk of sitting still. So on the one hand, we have benefits of physical activity, and sedentary behavior lies at the far end of the physical activity continuum. So right on the far side here, we have sitting still. Well, first you have sleep. Then you have sitting still. Then you have standing. Then you have, walking, running, vigorous exercise at the other end. So all of that physical activity has a benefit, but the sedentary behavior seems to have an effect on health that is largely independent of that physical activity. And so that's a concept that is, quite new, that's emerged from the research, but it's very important from a public health perspective. So it means that it's not enough just to encourage people, optimally, it's not enough to just encourage people to do more physical activity. We want to encourage people to be more active during the day, to exercise, to stick to meet the guidelines for physical activity. But in addition to that, we also want them to think about how much time they spend sitting during the day, because you can be highly active physically and go running for an hour each day or half an hour each day, which is great, and that has benefits. But you can then be very still during the day for 8 or 10 hours. And the research is showing that 8 or 10 hours still has a negative impact, even if you go running for half an hour a day. If you go running for an hour a day, you might be offsetting the impact of you could probably get away. Yeah.
Okay.
But for most people don't do that. So yeah.
What was it that has been measured here? So is this cardiovascular, is the heart, or what is it that's been measured?
In one of the big studies that came out a couple of years ago, it was mortality. So it was deaths.
Right.
So they were talking about the risk of reducing the risk of death.
Okay.
With different combinations of physical activity and sitting still. But I think it's highly likely that we would see similar associations if we were measuring cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and so on as the outcome, because the deaths are linked to those those diseases. Right. So it's a pretty simple take-home message in a way. We want people to be physically active, to meet the 150 minutes per week at least, if not more. But in addition to that, just to think about how much time we spend during the day sitting, because that's so prevalent, it's so common.
I have two thoughts. Like, one of them is that 70% doesn't meet the 150 minutes per week.
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah, exactly. Roughly 70%. So so it's kind of so I got to do this 150 minutes and then I have to also move during. So so the problem is, of course, to prioritize. Would you prioritize to to start off, I mean, exercising after you had your entire workday, or would you prioritize to get up and do push-ups or squats or I don't know what you're supposed to do during the day? Or
I think you should come in and you should do 10 minutes of burpees
yeah,
every day.
yeah.
That's my personal
in your
advice.
Suit.
Yeah, in your suit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have the CEO standing there with these dumbbells. So.
Yeah, or with his briefcase, just whatever works.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You have to improvise. You know, I don't think it matters when
No.
you do it. It depends on your individual training goals. The message is that people need to just be cognizant or aware of how much time they sit still during the day and try to break it up. So people don't necessarily need to take breaks every 5 minutes, but every 30 minutes, 45 minutes is probably enough to reduce the risk associated with prolonged sitting. So that's achievable for most people. Standing up, taking a brief walk, that's normally enough to break up the detrimental health effects of long-term sitting.
Right. So it doesn't have to be doing squats or
No.
It doesn't. It's just getting up, taking a 5-minute walk every 45 minutes.
Yeah, it doesn't even need to be 5 minutes. It could be just taking a 1 or 2 minute brisk walk in the corridor in your office, or occasionally I do go into a room next to my desk and sort of squat up and down, or do a few sort of jumps, just to get the blood flowing.
Yeah.
But whatever you can do practically to break up sitting for very long periods of time during the day is likely, in the long run, if you make this part of your lifestyle, to have to reduce some of the risks of sitting if you normally sit all day. Now, if you're someone who is outside and working, this is not relevant to you. You don't have to worry about it. So this is relevant to people who are in offices mainly. Yeah,
exactly. It also gets a lot. I mean, for me, I'm working on my own, so I don't have to care about like social codes. I mean, I could just do burpees at home when I'm working from home. But I mean,
that's convenient.
It becomes harder though, when of course when you're working in an office or something.
Or it could be stretching your sort of relationship with people to just suddenly drop down and do burpees next to a colleague who's writing a report.
With a printer or just a coffee machine. Somebody who you don't really know.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or it could be a good conversation point. You know, who knows?
I was actually thinking about it when I was preparing for our conversation. I was thinking about like how to implement this, and because I think one thing is probably like to get it into your routine, kind of. So for me, I think one thing could be like every time I go to the bathroom, I'll also do 5 squats or 10 squats or something. So like just because that's really simple. I think I don't think the hard part is, or I think it's 2 things. One thing is that it's kind of, if you're in a workflow, I don't think I'm that keen to I'll just go do the walk now because I'm really into the work, and that will probably interrupt me, which will make me not be as productive with that task. But I do go to the bathroom every 2 hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, I don't know. But so that would be kind of an easy way to just so every time I go to the bathroom, I'll just do 10 squats, and then that would probably.
That sounds good to me. I think we just don't want it to be too complicated for people.
Exactly.
Just do whatever works for you. So one thing you can do as well is, if you have a desk you can raise, if you stand during the day, that's a benefit. I think the evidence is showing that if you have what we call active breaks, this is a little bit better than just standing. But doing squats, of course, at your desk, up and down a few times, taking a short walk, or just twisting your body around lightly like this. People can't see what I'm doing, but moving from side to side.
Exactly.
Anything that is practical in your work environment doesn't disturb other people too much, of course.
Because that is kind of the thing also with exercise and everything, right? That if you have to make it convenient for you, right?
Convenience, exactly. Yeah.
Make it easy for you to.
Correct. Yeah. It shouldn't be too complicated. We just want the message to be sit less and move more during the day, and just find any way to do that you can. For example, whenever my phone calls or if there's a text, I get up. I use that as a signal to move, which is quite frequent. So, or if I want to talk to someone in the office, I'll always go to them. I won't send an email. I just look for excuses to move a bit.
Right.
Yeah. So it doesn't need to be complicated. We just want people to break up this long periods of sitting for hours without much movement.
Yeah. But there's also been studies on sedentary behavior during the days and mental health.
There have, yeah. So we've been working on that as well. And something quite interesting that we've found recently is that it appears that not all sedentary behaviors have equivalent detrimental effects on mental health. Some might be worse than others. And indeed, some might have just a neutral effect or even potentially a benefit when it comes to mental health. So I think when somatic health is the outcome,
so that's bodily health,
physical health, then it doesn't appear to make a tremendous difference what type of sedentary behavior you're engaged in. It's a low energy expenditure. But if mental health is the outcome, different sedentary behaviors might make a difference. So we've categorized them into two broad groups that we call mentally active and mentally passive. So a good example of a mentally passive sedentary behavior is watching TV. So why do we call that mentally passive? It's because you're not very engaged normally cognitively, mentally, when you're watching TV.
It's not happening as much in your brain.
Not as much is happening
upstairs. If you're comparing
upstairs.
to like, doing planning something. Or...
Yeah. So if you were to scan someone's brain when they're watching TV, perhaps it would depend to some degree on what they're watching, but you wouldn't see as much activity in certain areas of the brain that were perhaps linked to mood and how people feel compared to if they were doing other things with their brain. So this is very sort of new research. We don't fully understand the mechanisms behind these associations, but we have seen that passive sedentary behaviors tend to be associated with more detrimental outcomes than mentally active sedentary behaviors, such as what we're doing now, or participating in a meeting at work where you have to really be on your toes and use executive functioning, and processing speed becomes very important. You have to answer questions and move information through the brain, so to speak, more rapidly, make decisions, etc. That requires the use of the brain in a different way, and that has a physiological underlying as well. So we think that the types of sedentary behaviors that might be worst for mental health are those that are particularly passive. And it does make sense, because if you think of depression and common mental illness, it's often characterized by being sedentary and passive mentally. People tend to slow down, find decision-making harder, or are slower in making decisions. Behaviorally, often people will, not always, but often people with depression, moderate and severe depression, will slow down physically. So there's some obvious connections there. And I think, as humans, we're meant to move and to be more active mentally and physically. So it's not so surprising that we might see that people who do a lot of those passive behaviors, that we see links with outcomes like depression. Yeah,
it does seem quite logical that, if you're very sedentary, it affects mental health. It has a lot to do with not doing so much.
Correct.
Probably.
Yeah, but we there's still a lot more to learn. We normally start with these sort of what we call epidemiological studies, where we look at associations, either at cross-sectionally at a point in time or prospectively over time. But they need to be complemented with some sort of biological plausibility.
Yeah.
So we need to now think about how could we test or how could we assess the mechanisms that might explain these associations that we've observed in, in epidemiological data.
Yeah. It seems kind of logical that if you're active during sitting still and being active, it has a good effect on mental health. And if you're sitting still doing nothing, it has a bad effect on mental health.
Yeah, and we also need to tease out whether the potential positive effects of sitting still, so engaging in cognitively active tasks, if they're just linked to, the work situation, for instance, and what's going on there. So these are early observations, but we've definitely, and not just us, there's also some colleagues from Japan who found similar findings. So it's not just us that have observed this in a single set of data. It's in another part of the world with different people and different data. They found quite similar associations. So there's something going on there when it comes to mental health and sitting still. So we're still working on that. I don't have all the answers, but it's an interesting observation initially, at least.
Yeah, for sure.
Another thing that happens, of course, when talking about watching TV, is that people often do things when they're watching TV that can be not so good for health, like eating fatty food, chips, soft drinks, things like that. So that can perhaps explain some of the link to bad physical health and maybe also mental health.
Yeah. But it's quite interesting, as you said before, that when you're all these health things cluster. So if you're becoming physically active, there's a bigger chance of you eating better, and if you eat better, then you probably get more energy, and then perhaps you'll start engaging with people you like, and when you do that, you perhaps get even more energy, and then you probably sleep better because you have better relationships, and then you have more energy to move. And it seems like this kind of upward or downward spiral depending on what's happening in your life.
Yes, I think that's right. There is an interesting little twist to this, though.
Yeah,
and that's with alcohol.
Yeah,
alcohol overall has poor effects, bad effects on our health. There is some research showing that it, in light amounts, it can be good for the cardiovascular system. It can improve the blood lipid profile, which reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. But overall, there's no question that alcohol has a bad effect on health. It increases the risk of all sorts of acute problems, accidents, injuries, falling over, and chronic health problems.
Yeah.
But interestingly, with physical activity and alcohol, we tend to see that there's a positive association between them in the general population.
What
does that mean? So if you take a survey of people, in a large survey in the general population, and you measure how much physical activity they do, and you ask them how much they drink, as the people who drink more also tend to be slightly more physically active. Now that's paradoxical. Why is that? Because when we look at other health behaviors, like sleep, like diet, they tend to correlate. They tend to be associated or cluster.
Yeah, exactly. But if one go up, the other one also go up.
Yeah. But why would people who are focused on physical activity and do a lot of that, why would they drink more? It's a bit paradoxical. So there's various explanations for that. One of them is this idea that a lot of these surveys involve younger and middle-aged people. And one idea is that they often play hard and work hard. So they're very focused on family, going to the gym, getting out, being active, and then being social in a hard way. Okay, it's the weekend, so we need to catch up with people. This involves drinking and alcohol use. So what does that mean then? And also another issue is biology. Both physical activity and alcohol use are rewarding
That's
behaviors.
what I was thinking on sitting here.
So the dopaminergic system is involved in both. At least at certain levels of physical activity and drinking. If you drink far too much, it's not rewarding any longer. And perhaps the same thing can be said of physical activity, depending on your level of training. So there's some underlying biological mechanisms that could explain why they're both related positively.
Because that was what I was thinking also when you brought it up, the correlation that perhaps the people who are exercising, they get more of a dopamine hit or a subjective dopamine hit, and also get the same effect on alcohol, because alcohol also affects different people in different ways. So perhaps it's that it's the same people who gets the alcohol hit also gets the exercise hit, kind of on a subjective dopamine.
Exactly. That's one possibility. But I think, again, this is a little gap in the research. We're not entirely sure. But there is some biological plausibility there, connecting both physical activity and light to moderate alcohol consumption with the dopaminergic system. They're rewarding. But what does that mean in terms of using exercise as a treatment for alcohol use disorder? That's because that's something that we're involved in at the moment, is a study on that. And I think you still can use it, but what we see is that in people that have dependence, this positive association disappears.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if someone is a moderate or severely dependent heavy drinker, they tend to be physically inactive.
Okay, now I get it. That sounds logical.
So if you're someone that surveyed in the general population that drinks at a light to moderate level, then you're probably more likely to be physically active. There's a positive relationship there, broadly speaking. But if you have dependence, you're more likely to be physically inactive. And the reason for that is because alcohol consumed at moderate to high levels can have effects that discourage physical activity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, as we know. And people who drink that much tend not to be as focused on healthful living and a healthy lifestyle. So there's certainly an opportunity there to intervene with that group, despite the fact that we see this, what looks like a paradoxical relationship between physical activity and alcohol at lower levels of consumption.
I was thinking of these heavy drinkers that are not exercising. Could exercise be a substitute for drinking if we'll just so linked to the dopamine system? So could it be that instead of course it's just so much more complex than this, but could it be that you can get the same hit from going on from exercising instead of drinking?
It's a great question, and potentially. I think that there's no question that people who become addicted to alcohol feel a sense of reward in some form or another when they drink, either a reduced anxiety or relief, or they get a slight kick from drinking. It can depend on the individual, but physical activity could potentially help replace that that reward that they normally associate with alcohol. And there's some interesting studies with animal models, so using rats and mice to sort of back up this idea. I was reading one recently by a researcher named Lee Leisure. She's a neuroscientist, and what they did basically was they took rats and they made some of them exercise for 2 weeks. Another group didn't exercise for 2 weeks, so they had them on this spinning wheel in a cage, forcing them to exercise. And then they gave them alcohol every 8 hours for 4 days. So they forced them to sort of binge drink. And they looked at what had happened in those 4 days when they binge drank. So you've got two groups, one group that exercised first, another group that didn't exercise.
Right.
And then they were both given alcohol for 4 days. So the ones that exercised first, they found two things. First of all, they behaviorally, they didn't show as many signs of intoxication. So they didn't appear as drunk as the ones who had exercised first. So it had some effect on behavioral indications of alcohol use.
So the exercisers didn't seem as drunk.
They didn't seem as drunk, the rats. Yeah. Now, to what extent we can extrapolate or extend those findings to humans is another question for discussion. But that's what they found. And they also found that they measured the neuron loss in an area of the brain called the dentate gyrus, which is part of the hippocampal region.
Yeah. Memory and learning
and mood. Yeah. And also mood. And they found that the group who had exercised for 2 weeks had not lost a significant number of neurons in that region despite the alcohol consumption, whereas the group who didn't exercise and then took the alcohol lost a significant number of neurons in that region. So what that suggests basically is that the exercise, and this is a long story, but the exercise had a protective effect in this model, this rat model or animal model of binge drinking. And it affected both the number of neurons in the brain in an area that's connected to mood and cognition. And it also affected their behavior. So this study and others like it, offers support for the biological plausibility of exercise interventions with people that have an alcohol use disorder. They suggest that it's likely to have, effects on the brain that we can see that translate into behavior.
Yeah, that's right.
So, in addition to it being an appealing or attractive intervention to people and non-stigmatizing, it has some biological effects that are very interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
I think it's so interesting how how all these different interventions and things actually can affect the brain. That we can affect the brain a lot more than we previously thought. With exercise being, I think, one of the top things probably.
There's been a lot of focus on exercise and cognition, and there's a Swedish psychiatrist, Anders Hansen, who's written what's become a very famous book on that as well.
It's becoming international now as well.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's easy to read and fascinating. And it's also, importantly, it's backed up by a lot of science.
Yeah.
So,
but that's the cool thing, right? That this is no mumbo jumbo. It's kind of this big meta-analysis is showing that if you're depressed, it really seems to have an effect on the general population, which is, great, because then it's not just one person. It's a lot of different kinds of people. But also, I think almost anyone can feel the effect. If you ask them, like, how do you feel after your exercise, if they haven't gone crazy with exercise. But everybody feels it as well. I think it's very intuitive.
Yeah. The effects that we see tend not to be strongly moderated or affected by gender or age. So, and also if you're healthy or if you have a chronic illness, we see the same effects, more or less. So that's very important to know as well. Exercise is something that can be prescribed for people to feel better who are healthy or who have a chronic illness.
Yeah.
And we know that chronic illness is linked to a higher risk of mental health problems. For example, if you have cardiovascular disease, if you've had a treatment for cardiovascular disease, let's say an operation, you've had a stent put in your heart, for instance, because you've had plaque building up and you've had a heart attack. People that have been through this sometimes experience a mental health reaction, to it. And exercise is normally recommended for the physical health problem there, but also for the related mental health problem. So there's groups of people that have both somatic health problems and mental health problems that I think it's very good for.
And also, most of the research has been done on mental health. So depression, also anxiety, not as much, but also anxiety. But I mean, for normal people who doesn't have a diagnosis like depression or anxiety, I mean, it also seems like everybody is becoming, their well-being is increased. What does the data say about that? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, you don't need to have depression to benefit from exercise.
Right.
If you're not depressed and normally feel quite well, it can boost your mood and help you feel more productive at work. It can help improve your memory or to optimize your memory, your capacity to learn, absorb new information, concentrate. There's a lot of studies in animals and humans showing that now. So it's not just about, as you say, depression and anxiety. And also, but if we do think of mental illness at the sort of severe end of the mental health spectrum, it's psychosis. There are studies there showing that exercise is very important. And indeed, people with severe mental illness die prematurely, about 15 to 20 years, depending on the study you look at, largely as a consequence of not doing enough exercise and the lifestyle that they have and the medications that they take which promote weight gain. So it's really important in that group, I think, to offset some of those known, health problems with physical activity. And there's really, in a sense, no substitute for it.
Right.
You can't take medicine to solve all health problems. So if we take that population as an example, there's no substitute for increasing the amount that they move. And slowly we're starting to see that recognized in treatment guidelines now. So, exercise cuts across the whole spectrum of mental well-being, from people with severe mental health problems through to people who are happy and productive. It's for everyone.
Yeah, and it's also protective. I mean, if let's say you're healthy and you're doing your exercise, you're on 150 minutes a week, it also becomes a protection for depression, for different kind of other diagnoses, and also for cardiovascular things. And
it's a great point. Very much so. It's protective, and that's much better than increasing your risk by not exercising and then starting it later. So there's plenty of good reasons to be encouraging the general population to be more active, and people who have a diagnosis to become more active if they're not already active.
I think it's very interesting how you could try to get it out there into the system. I think this is probably happening now, not in an international scale, but it's at least in Sweden, I think it's starting to get out more into the schools and stuff. But I think it would be so great for the younger generations to learn about these things, to have these tools, to know that, okay, if you're physically active, you absolutely don't have to be like an elite sportsman or woman. But if you're doing you're doing your 150 minutes a week, this is something that really can affect your mood and affect a lot of other stuff as well. So it would be great to get it out there into the school system and trying to...
Yeah. I'm just thinking of, when I was in school, this is a long time ago, of course, but there was physical activity was promoted, and it still is in school. You have to participate in sports and so on, but I don't think most schools actually have it in their curriculum. This sort of information about this kind of research. No, and it could be delivered to them in very simple messages. It wouldn't need to be complicated necessarily. So I think with colleagues around the world, we're slowly working towards that, getting it into the training of people who work with So clinicians, the training of clinicians, making them aware of this, trying to restructure the way services are delivered or operate, so that for example, doctors are able to refer someone to a person who can prescribe exercise and follow them up. And also, as you mentioned, just getting the message out into schools when people are young, so that it's second nature to them, or at least the knowledge is second nature. Yeah.
Is there something that we haven't discussed that you would like to discuss?
I think we've covered a lot about physical activity and mental health, which is, as you know, one of my research focuses and sort of passion and interest. I just love exercise myself.
Me too.
Yeah. And we, if I could mention it, some excellent colleagues have published a book about this, which is a summary of the evidence.
Right.
And it's aimed at academics and clinicians, but the general public could be interested in it too.
Yeah.
So it's about exercise and mental health.
I think they looked it up. Exercise-based interventions for mental illness.
Correct.
Physical activity as part of clinical treatment.
Thanks.
I wrote it here.
That's good. Thank you for the precise title. Yeah. So I have some colleagues, Brendan Stubbs and Simon Rosenbaum.
Yeah.
Brendan's at King's College London, and Simon's another Australian. So they put together this outstanding book, and I was lucky enough to contribute a chapter to that on exercise for alcohol use disorder. But it covers all of the mental illnesses, and it describes the rationale for using physical activity in the prevention and treatment of these.
So how you can use it as well, not only just what the science says, but only how you can use it.
Exactly.
Okay.
So in different chapters of the book, it talks about the frequency, the intensity of exercise that's optimal and so on for different problems. And it talks about the system, how it can be changed to integrate physical activity more in the system, also in the forensic system, for elderly people, for young people in schools, serious mental illness. It covers a lot. So it's the most comprehensive and up-to-date review of the research. And
also done by researchers.
I think
that's also an important thing. That's also, it's you guys who are actually working with researching this stuff that's done it. So that's
correct.
It makes it a lot more reliable as well.
Yeah, it's up to date, and I think all of us have tried to be very balanced in our statements about exercise and its potential effects. I think we don't want to overstate the effects either. Other treatments always have a place, and it's good to have an array of treatments for different people.
Yeah.
But I'm a strong promoter and believer in exercise for, I think, almost all mental health problems. Yeah.
I have some last rapid fire questions.
Oh no.
Are you ready?
You're putting me on the spot. Yeah, that's fine.
Exactly.
That's no problem. Go ahead.
Okay, the first one is, what purchase of 100 US or 100 euros has had the greatest impact on your health or well-being the last couple of years? So something you bought that has had the greatest impact on your health or well-being the last years.
A Fitbit. So, one of these wrist-worn watches that can tell me how much I've moved during the day, and then I can connect it to a program that shows me that information.
Right. So it's something that where you get data from your own exercise, and then you get it into a computer.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So instead of just estimating how far I've run, or thinking about the time I've spent at the gym or in the pool or whatever, this gives me more precise information. So that's kind of fun to look at.
Isn't there studies also on that using data and measuring how much you're doing and then setting goals is something that actually works when it comes to adherence as well?
Yeah, I think it does. We're all a bit different. Overall, I think that's the effect that it has, but some people just prefer not to be connected to any of this. They just like to go out and run, go to the gym and not be bothered. But I actually quite like to see if I did what I set out to do during the week. So I'd say that's, for me and for a lot of people, I think that's changed my behavior a little bit, my exercise behavior.
Yeah, I think this, these 10,000 steps, this is something that I think, this is just my personal point of view, but it probably drives behavior. I've heard about friends who are like, no, I had 8,000 steps and then I had to take 2,000 more, and something like it's very easy to see if you've done it, and then you, of course, you can set a goal that doesn't have to be 10,000 steps, but it's also something it's very concrete.
It's very much, and I think that message has gone to many people. Yeah. I mean, I think my mother knew about that before I did. Yeah. So she's been looking at her smartphone and counting her steps. So I think there is a place for technology and in promoting physical activity. I also think it's okay to not use it.
Yeah, sure.
It's just horses for courses.
Okay, so during the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit have had the greatest impact on your life?
Well, I think in the last 5 years, I've changed the sitting.
Yeah.
So probably, I'd say 7 years ago, I was sitting all day long at work. I hadn't really changed my behavior in that regard, but now I take regular breaks from sitting. So if we're thinking about physical activity,
bikes and chairs, and
the main change that I've made to my own behavior in the last, say, 5 years. I'm very cognizant of that. Just don't spend the whole day looking at your screen and sitting.
Right, getting up, moving.
Any sort of movement, to get a glass of water, talk to a friend. Sometimes I'll close the door and do a few burpees, whatever.
That's great. Actually, now when I'm talking to you, I'll also probably start to implement something about that as well.
When this interview's over, we'll drop down and do a few burpees.
Exactly.
That'll be this.
And all your colleagues out there will just be wondering what the hell's going on here.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, what are bad recommendations or a fad that you hear related to health, well-being, or something like in your area?
Well, one thing that pops to mind immediately is this TV show called The Biggest Loser.
Right.
I don't want to pick on that show per se, but just the idea behind it, where people who are overweight or obese, are more or less forced to exercise at a very vigorous intensity in order to lose weight and try to feel better. And I think that's not the way to go. No. I think there's a ton of research that shows that people are more likely to feel bad when they do that, and that sets up a cycle where people actually learn that when I exercise, I feel worse. It's not rewarding. Yeah. So we want to optimize people's mood or affective response to exercise, and the best way to do that is to find a level of exercise that makes them feel good. So that will vary a bit from one person to the next. So that's something I have thought was not good in the physical activities area space. Yeah.
So doing something that's on your own level, kind of. So you don't feel bad from exercising.
Yes, the goal with exercise, I think, should always be, if you're training for something, you might want to push yourself to a level where you're on the brink of feeling bad.
Yeah.
That's different. But I think for most people, the goal with exercise should be to finish a training session, and also during the training session to feel, you might feel that you're straining moderately, but to do that at a level where you still feel good in some sense. We don't want people to feel exhausted, fatigued, like they're almost going to pass out or vomit. Exactly. I mean, it's really the wrong way to go. And that's what I see happening in that show, for example.
Okay, so if you were a leader of a country, let's say Australia, Sweden, whatever, what would be one thing that you would like to change?
Oh gosh, that's a very general...
It's just a hypothetical...
Okay, so staying with the theme of movement and activity, I think I would like to see environments set up that are more conducive to activity. For example, one thing that Stockholm really does well are the bike lanes. So it's possible to ride to work. They're separated from the pedestrian lanes and the car lane. This is a really simple thing we don't think about very much. But it's not like that in most big cities.
Right.
And so that forces you to use cars, use public transport. It means less activity. So I think more green space and more thought of how people get from A to B, and giving people, setting up cities in ways, I'm thinking of urban design here, setting up cities in ways that encourage more activity, more movement, and give people more access to green space. That would be that'd be one of my goals. Yeah.
All right. So a huge thank you for being part of the show again. It's always so much fun to talk to you.
Thanks so much, André. Yeah, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure. I enjoyed the chat.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, including the giving of medical advice. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.